I want to bring in James Fabisiak. He is an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health. Thank you for being with us this morning. Evan was there covering this story because it is important. People are concerned about their own health following this situation. What more can you tell us about the specific chemicals involved in this derailment and the long-term implications it could pose to the people in East Palestine?
Sure. I mean, this is actually a situation that seems to evolve sort of on a day-by-day basis with new information sort of coming out. So in the early days after the derailment, the primary focus was on vinyl chloride, which has significant long-term chronic implications. And that's in part one of the reasons, as well as the risk of an explosion, that a controlled burn was actually conducted to try to mitigate some of that. Now, obviously, some very toxic things could be produced in that burn, but the sort of short-term evacuation was a way to sort of mitigate that. However, more recently, we've kind of learned that there are sort of additional chemicals. Butyl acrylate is one of them. There are some others that weren't necessarily talked about in those early days. It's not clear whether the Norfolk Southern did not tell the EPA or whether the EPA was, not paying attention to them. I can't really tell, but, I think we need to think about what the sort of mixture of chemicals that are in the ground now potentially or in the water, what the long-term implications of that might be.
So when you see dead fish in the water, people are reporting that their pets are ill. There was one family that had to put their cat down because of some liver issues. What are the health ramifications, the things that people should be looking for that concern you as you know more about vinyl chloride and its implications?
Right. So I think it's a significant observation that so many animals, for example, are getting sick. I mean, I think animals can actually provide sort of an early warning sentinel system that sort of one can use to monitor what might be going on in an environmental disaster like this. That leads us to why we used canaries in a coal mine who would essentially succumb to carbon monoxide or other toxic gases long before the miners would. But they served as an early warning system to those miners to be able to then do something about that. So there's a variety of reasons that animals would be more affected. They breathe more per unit time. They're smaller. It takes less amount of that chemical. They're closer to the ground. They're grooming themselves and licking contaminants that might be deposited on their skin, which humans don't necessarily do. But the fact is that those animals could actually be more sensitive to those toxins because they're receiving a slightly larger exposure. So I would pay very close attention to what happens with animals as well as what's happening with symptoms that may be encountered by the people who live there as well.
Well, I don't blame the folks who live in East Palestine for being concerned. They're going to be at a community meeting later tonight asking some of these important questions. But given what we're seeing and what you're saying, a lot of the dead fish, 3,500 dead fish in the water, does the EPA know something that we don't? Am I missing something here? I
don't know if they know any. I mean, I'm sure they know some more than is being talked about. The dead fish to me is not as concerning as perhaps some other things. I mean, if you had a large chemical spill in the water, fish would largely be affected. They'd certainly live in that water 24 hours a day. What would be sort of more concerning is whether any of that chemical can get into well water. I mean, people are probably not drinking that water that's from that stream. So are the chemicals making their way through the ground into groundwater that's being used as a source in wells? I think one of the most important things that people could ask at this meeting is to try to find out if, and it's a very broad question, in order to do this well, we have to measure the right things, in other words, the right chemicals that are known to be involved in this spill. We have to measure them in the right place. We have to measure them at the right time and in the right way.
NewsNation will be at that meeting later tonight as they ask these very important questions as it pertains to their health. Professor James Fabisiak with the university. of Pittsburgh School of Public Health. We appreciate you giving us some insight as we learn more about vinyl chloride and maybe more importantly, how hazardous materials are transported through so many of our communities via train. Thank you again. Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.